you are looking at a false past. Museums are not repositories of truth. They are machines for the rigid editing of history. For centuries, artifacts that did not fit the ideal picture of the world were literally bricked up, just as they did in Naples for 180 years. Today, entire halls of the largest institutions are covered with brown paper at a moment's notice, erasing inconvenient items even from digital archives. Who gave them the right to decide which part of history is permitted for you and which is strictly forbidden? Why are masterpieces that were touted for decades as indisputable ancient originals suddenly found to be cheap forgeries from the early 20th century? And how did it come to be that science dictates the laws of the universe while relying on a trimmed, censored, and artificially created showcase? From our school days, we were taught to unconditionally trust the labels under museum glass. The reality, however, is that behind every displayed item are thousands of hidden, lost, irreparably damaged by restorers, or simply unprofitable for display, artifacts that change the meaning of entire civilizations. And why is this massive concealment of their own mistakes only coming to light now? The Smithsonian Institution. 157 million objects. Less than 1% are publicly accessible. The British Museum. 8 million items, with only 80,000 visible. The Hermitage. 3 million, with 100,000 in the halls. The Louvre is considered the most accessible of the great museums in the world. 8 to a maximum of 10% of its exhibits are on public display. Stop. Count right now. 157 million is the Smithsonian's fund. In the exhibition, there are 1.5 million. This means that 155.5 million items you have never seen. Not because you didn't visit, not because you missed a hall, but because they are not displayed physically. They exist. They are stored, just not for you. The most obvious explanation is the lack of space, fragility, restoration, money. All of this is true, but then explain one thing. Take any major museum that has received a new wing or moved to a modern building in the last 30 years. The space has increased. The budget has grown. Digitization has advanced. The ratio of displayed works to those hidden has not changed. It was 1 to 100. It remains 1 to 100. The new spaces are filled with the same 1%. So it's not about the area. Look at it differently. When the Hermitage built a new wing in Starja Derja, its storage area significantly increased. When the British Museum launched a large-scale digitization program, hundreds of thousands of new entries were added to the database. When the Smithsonian opened additional storage facilities in Maryland, a vast amount of space was freed up. In none of these cases did the ratio of exhibited items to stored items change. This is not a temporary situation. It is a stable structure that has been reproducing itself for decades, regardless of external conditions. And here the question is relevant. If the problem isn't in space, then what is it? The answer provided by the professional community is as follows. A museum is not a repository for everything that has ever existed. It is a machine for producing meaning. The exhibition is not constructed on the principle of, let's show as much as possible, but rather on the principle of, let's create a coherent narrative from individual objects. A narrative requires selection. Selection always entails losses. This is an honest answer, and it's hard to argue with it. But it raises another question. Who determines what will be included in the narrative? What are the criteria? Whose interests are at play? And most importantly, how consciously are those 99% that will never make it into the story formed? Let's look at this through a specific number. The British Museum has an official document, a digitalization strategy for its collection. It states that full cataloging of all 8 million items will take several decades at the current pace. This means that hundreds of thousands of items exist in the database only as groups of objects, without individual descriptions. No one has seen them in person. No one knows exactly what is in a specific box. This is referred to as the unprocessed remainder. The British Museum is one of the most resourceful museum institutions in the world. If it has an unresolved backlog, just imagine what is happening in museums with less funding. What does this mean in practice for each specific item from this remainder? The researcher cannot request an item that is not in the database. Requests are made based on an inventory number, not on a box with estimated contents. The insurance company will not issue a policy without an individual description and assessment. Therefore, the item cannot be transported to a temporary exhibition. International protocols for exchange between museums require provenance documentation, meaning the item cannot go anywhere. And a scientific article will not accept a reference to a group of objects without description. The result? Thousands of items are legally and administratively locked within the very system that was created for their preservation. Now, another detail that is rarely mentioned openly. Most large museums have a policy of permanent retention. They cannot destroy items from their collection without a special decision from the Board of Trustees. In practice, this means that every year the collections grow due to new acquisitions, donations, and excavation material. But the resources to manage this growth do not increase proportionally. The gap between what is received and what is processed widens every year. Not a temporary problem, a structural one.
Next, I will show you 8 mechanisms, each of which contributes to this disappearance. Individually, each one seems completely reasonable. Physics, chemistry, morality, law, scientific error, human error, scale, selection. Together, they paint a different picture. Let's start with the most literal barrier, the physical one. Literally deadly. Step into any old natural history museum. The Bird Hall, the Mammal Hall, taxidermy exhibits from the 19th century. Take a good look. The feathers are perfectly arranged. The fur shines. Not a single frayed detail, not a trace of time. You think, professional conservation, good storage. Now open the safety manual for working with the collections of these institutions. It will state, do not touch the item without nitrile gloves. When working with a group of objects, respirator class FFP3. Storage, only in airtight boxes with hazard labeling. Why? Up to 30% of ethnographic and biological collections in the old museums of the world are impregnated with arsenic and mercury. The period of use ranged from the 18th century to the 1980s. The logic was simple to the extreme. Poison kills any insect faster and more reliably than any other method. It was not just applied, it was thoroughly soaked, to the state where the material became biologically unfit for life.
It worked perfectly. That's why the 19th century taxidermies have been preserved better than the collections from the 1930s. Those were made without arsenic, and they've long been devoured by moths. A craft detail that is important to understand. Taxidermists of that time worked with arsenic as though it were an ordinary professional tool. Arsenic soap, a mixture of arsenic anhydride and household soap, was applied to the inner surface of the skin with a brush. The skin was then stuffed, sewn up, and left to dry. No gloves, no masks. This was the norm.
Many taxidermists of that era suffered from chronic poisoning, skin darkening, hair loss, peripheral neuropathy, and never associated it with their work. But here's what matters. Complete deactivation is impossible without destroying the object itself. The poison does not escape. It remains there forever. When such a dummy is picked up, shaken, or moved from shelf to shelf, it emanates toxic dust, invisible, odorless. Absorption through the skin, inhalation with air movement, and just like that, the warehouse worker has received a dose they were unaware of. Here is the strangest part. Until recently, the catalog cards for these items contained no warnings at all. Just a description, the type of bird, the year of acquisition, the location where it was found. The exhibit that could poison you was listed as an ordinary exhibit. An employee would handle it without gloves, work with it for hours, and had no idea of the risk involved. It was only when several individuals in a number of major museums experienced unexplained symptoms while working with 19th century collections that investigations began. A number of museums in North America have been inspected. Old ethnographic items, clothing, jewelry, woven goods from indigenous peoples, showed arsenic levels ranging from 5 to 700 milligrams per kilogram. For comparison, the lethal dose in cases of chronic poisoning is as little as 1 milligram per day with regular contact. Now it's a question of scale. Arsenic was used not only for biological samples, it was also applied to ethnographic items from colonial-era museums. Clothing made of leather and fur, ornaments with bird feathers, woven products with organic threads. Any item that could become food for insects received its dose. This means that toxic collections exist not only in natural history museums. They are present in ethnographic, anthropological, and local history museums as well. In any institution that collected such materials in the 19th century. The Smithsonian began selective testing of its collections for arsenic content several years ago. Only selective testing, because complete testing of 157 million objects is physically impossible. Preliminary results show that a significant portion of 19th century items tests positive. The relabeling program is underway, but it only covers what has already been described. Items that have never been entered into the database, the very ones from the unresolved remnants, are not tested, because they are formally unknown. A public display of such items is technically impossible. Air movement in the hall, vibrations from the footsteps of visitors, the opening and closing of doors, all of this stirs up the tiniest particles from the surface. They move into the ventilation system and settle, in other halls, on other exhibits, on windowsills where children place their hands. Currently, there is a large-scale relabeling program underway at the Smithsonian Institution. However, it only covers items that have already been attributed and described. No one knows how many boxes containing unmarked items have remained unopened since 1900. The storage room of a major museum is not a warehouse of antiquities. It is a zone with hazardous substances where every third item could poison you if you handle it without the proper gloves.
Arsenic hides without choice. It doesn't know what exactly it conceals. The next barrier is also physical, but it concerns the most well-known things in the world. Look at any photograph of Munch's The Scream, taken 50 years ago. Compare it with what hangs today. Notice the yellow color of the sky. In the old images, it is sharp, almost aggressive, unsettling. Today, it is muted, touched with a whitish haze. This is not a quality of old film. It's a chemical process that's happening right now, and it can't be stopped.
The research at the synchrotron in Grenoble is a facility that literally penetrates the image with a beam of radiation with molecular precision, revealing the decay mechanism completely. Munch used cadmium yellow, which is cadmium sulfide. In the presence of moisture and oxygen, it oxidizes. The sulfide turns into sulfate. The bright yellow stroke becomes a dirty white crust that gradually starts to crumble and flake off over time. The reaction is irreversible. And here's what makes it truly specific. Visitors bring moisture, simply by their breath. Every person in the room slightly hastens the demise of the painting. Not maliciously, not intentionally, just physiology. The optimal storage conditions: humidity below 45%, lighting below 50 lux. An open exhibition violates both parameters every day. In the professional world of restorers, there is a term: light budget. Each item receives a limit of photons over its lifetime. When that limit is exhausted, the item either enters absolute darkness or deteriorates. Take silk from the Tang dynasty, for example. The allowable exposure to light is 2 years for every 10. 8 years must be spent in darkness. This is not a whim of the curator. It is a physical constant of the material. The problem is not just in the Scream. Munch worked with cadmium pigments in dozens of his works. Sick Girl, Madonna, The Scream. Each of these pieces has its own light budget and its own point of no return. The Norwegian Museum is addressing this as a systematic issue. Conservators take samples measuring 0.5 millimeter, literally microscopic interventions, and determine, based on the chemical composition of the dust, the stage of degradation for each area of the canvas. But Munch is no exception. He is one of the most studied cases because he is well documented and located in a single national collection. Worldwide, there are thousands of paintings with the same pigments: cadmium yellow, cadmium red, cadmium orange. Van Gogh used it extensively. Cézanne, Matisse, Gauguin. The entire post-impressionism is largely a story of cadmium decay, which is happening right now. Each of these paintings has its own light budget. Each has its own storage conditions. Some of them hang in the halls permanently. Some periodically go on vacation to the storerooms. But this is not publicized, because to publicize it would mean to acknowledge the object you came for is in the process of irreversible decline. And the question is not whether this will happen. The question is how soon. If you think that digital copies solve the problem, think again. When a museum hangs a high-quality reproduction on the wall instead of the original, does it show the past or a simulation of the past? This is not rhetoric. It's a fundamental question that the museum community is discussing right now. And while there is no consensus yet, the originals are kept. They are being displayed less and less.
In the reserve, the cry is kept in an environment with minimal oxygen content and controlled humidity. In the catalog is a photograph of it, brighter than the original. In the hall is an object that slowly departs from merely being looked at. In the conservator's report are spectrograms of the migration of chlorine ions between layers of paint. The museum does not hide the painting out of whim. It is trying to preserve it. But the result for the viewer is the same. The object is inaccessible. Physics hides without choice. The next barrier, it chose. And it chose for 200 years straight. 1819, Naples. King Francis I visits the National Museum with his wife and daughter. They examine the artifacts from Pompeii and Herculaneum, cities buried under the ashes of Vesuvius in 79 A.D. Among the exhibits are bronze figurines, oil lamps, decorative items.
Some of them depict what was referred to in the 19th century as indecency. In a few hours, the royal decree will be issued. Remove it immediately. What exactly has been removed? Phallic lamps. In ancient Rome, they illuminated homes and shops. Bronze amulets called fascianus, phallic figurines that were hung above doorways, over children's beds, and at city gates as a safeguard against the evil eye and misfortune. Wind chimes, known as tintinnabulum, adorned with images of creatures in various poses. They tinkled at the entrances of baths and taverns, warding off evil spirits. Erotic frescoes from lupanaria, establishments that were a common part of the urban landscape in Pompeii, with signs on the street and a price list at the entrance. In 1849, the entrance to the storage of these items was bricked up. Physically. Sala 18, the 18th hall, disappeared from the museum's map. Access was granted only to gentlemen of mature age and proven morality, and only upon personal approval. At first glance, it seems like a different time, different morals, a familiar history. But here is what is important to understand about these subjects themselves. In first-century Rome, the phallic amulet was an utterly commonplace object. It hung above the entrance of a bakery, for good fortune in trade, above a child's cradle, for protection against illness, around the neck of a soldier, for bravery in battle. No resident of Pompeii regarded it as something shameful. It was a normal religious practice integrated into everyday life. The museum of the 18th and 19th centuries created a boundary that did not exist in the original culture at all. It divided antiquity into high, marble heroes, philosophical texts, triumphal reliefs, and awkward, everything that did not fit the image of a noble civilization that bequeathed to us democracy and stoicism. The awkward part was left behind a brick wall. This is what it historically cost. Due to the closure of the collection, several generations of scholars have worked with an incomplete picture of everyday life in Rome. Understanding what was considered sacred, what was mundane, and what was protective in this culture developed without access to a whole layer of material. Academic texts from the 19th and early 20th centuries about the high spirit of antiquity were written by people who physically could not see half of the excavated artifacts. It's akin to studying the lives of individuals solely through formal portraits and drawing conclusions about how they lived at home. But there is another layer to this story that is discussed less frequently:
When an object is hidden behind a brick wall, it affects not only the researchers who cannot see it, it influences how the other objects are interpreted. If you study the religion of Rome solely through the official cults, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, you receive a picture of state religion. If you include phallic amulets that hung in shops and cradles, the picture becomes fundamentally different. Popular magic, apotropaic practices, daily contact with the sacred through everyday objects. 181 years behind the brick wall, and an entire layer of understanding was inaccessible. Scholars constructed theories, unaware that half of the source material was sealed off by royal decree. And that's not all. In Pompeii itself, right at the excavation sites, erotic frescoes in the houses were covered with metal curtains. They would be opened for a separate fee, which was paid to the guide. The historical site had turned into a theater with paid access to its own history. The viewer paid for the right to see what any passerby in the 1st century AD could have simply by looking up at the wall. Several times in history, the cabinet was briefly opened. Under Garibaldi in 1860, it was closed again. In the 60s of the 20th century, access was limited to adults with written permission. Full open access was established only in the year 2000, 181 years behind a brick wall. The change of perspective here is fundamental. It is a decision about which part of antiquity exists for the public. The official history of Rome was literally edited at the level of architecture. Everything that did not fit the desired image was removed, and the resulting gap was filled with bricks. If the museum has kept a massive layer of culture behind its walls for 200 years, what does it consider inappropriate today? The answer to this question emerged in January 2024, and it looked unexpected. Visitors to the American Museum of Natural History in New York arrived at the Hall of Eastern Forests only to find it closed. The showcases were covered with brown paper. The shelves were empty. Where the exhibits once stood, informational signs read, "Consultations with communities in progress." No restoration, no relocation. Consultations. The Hall of the Great Plains presents the same picture. Several halls of the Field Museum in Chicago are closed. In the weeks following January 12, 2024, dozens of American museums will remove exhibits from display cases, delete images from online catalogs, and close entire sections of their collections. What happened? On this day, the updated requirements of the NAGPR law, the American Law on the Protection and Repatriation of Native American Graves, came into effect. The new rules are simple. Before exhibiting, studying, or moving Native American artifacts, a museum must obtain free, prior, and informed consent from any interested community. Sounds reasonable, until you start delving into the details. The Field Museum must align its decision with over 100 tribes, each having its own position. Some positions are in direct contradiction to one another. One tribe demands the complete return of the items. Another calls for their physical destruction, believing they should not exist outside of a sacred context. A third is open to dialogue, but only under certain conditions. Until all parties reach an agreement, the items remain inaccessible to anyone, not to the public, nor to researchers. And here is the real break. For decades, these collections have been studied. They have been dated, published, and dissertations written about them. They were considered objects of science. Now, under new rules, a researcher cannot approach such an artifact without the community's consent. Some academics call this censorship of scientific inquiry and point out that if knowledge disappears from access, understanding of the past narrows. Part of the communities respond differently. Our ancestors did not give consent to lie in your drawers. Those who came first did not ask for permission. Now we demand our own. While negotiations are ongoing, the item receives a special status in the museum documentation. Access suspended due to the NAGPRA process. This does not mean returned or recognized as museum property. It is an indefinite pause. The item is listed in the collection, but it cannot be issued, neither to a researcher, nor for an exhibition, nor for photography. The scale of the problem is specific. Museums in the United States still hold the remains of over 97,000 individuals. This is neither a metaphor nor an exaggeration. 97,000 represents documented remains of real people, stored in boxes and special sections of the collections of the country's largest scientific institutions. In addition, there are tens of thousands of burial items, sacred objects, and ritual accessories. The items exist. They are physically in storage. It's just that for the rest of the world, they don't exist. Look at how this looks in practice with one specific type of item: the sacred mask of the Hopi tribe.
It was crafted according to strict ritual rules, special prayers, specially processed materials, and the presence of authorized community members. According to Hopi tradition, such a mask is not an object. It is a living entity that exists as long as it is cared for according to the rules. It cannot be stored in an acid-neutral box at a constant temperature. This is not conservation. It is the slow fading of what lives within it. Now the Hopi communities are demanding the return of the masks not to keep them in another way, but to conduct a burial ritual, to properly conclude the life of the object that the museum interrupted. For the researcher, it is the destruction of a unique object with scientific value. For the community, this is the only possible act of respect. The institutional consequences are specific. Images of such masks are removed from online catalogs. Law requires approval before an image remains publicly accessible. Galleries with similar objects are closed indefinitely. Researchers' applications to work with the collections are frozen until consultations are completed. Graduate students planning dissertations on ritual collections receive notifications about the unavailability of materials without specific timelines. The item is still in the building. It's just that now it is a subject of negotiation rather than an object of study. 3 barriers are behind: physics, morality, law. The next one is the most paradoxical of all, because it doesn't hide danger or shame. It hides science itself, simply because it doesn't know what lies ahead. But first, one particular case that stands apart. Not physics, not law, not morality. Just what happens when an item ceases to exist in the database. August 2023. The British Museum. Peter Higgs, the curator of the Greek and Roman collections, has been dismissed. It turns out that for approximately 20 years, he had been smuggling items out of the storerooms: gold rings, gems, intaglios, semi-precious stones with carvings, and selling them on eBay. Price? Sometimes £40 for an item that was worth 50,000. About 2,000 items.
over 20 years. And here is what is important to understand about how this became possible. A collector from Denmark named Itai Gradel noticed a seller on eBay whose lots strangely resembled items that were supposed to be in the British Museum. He contacted the museum with this information. In the year 2021, 2 years before the scandal, the museum's response was, "We do not have these items. They are not ours." Why did the museum respond that way? Because the items were listed in the unaccessioned backlog, meaning they were physically in the building but had never been entered into the database. They did not have inventory numbers. They did not exist legally. And when the curator removed them, it was a neutral event for the system. Absent before, absent after. Think about it. A museum with a 200-year history, staffed by thousands of specialists, and with an annual budget in the hundreds of millions of pounds, didn't know that 2,000 items had been stolen. Not because it was poorly secured, but because they weren't in the computer. The situation revealed a fundamental fact. Out of the 8 million objects in the British Museum, hundreds of thousands of small items have not received inventory records over the 200 years. They existed in boxes, in envelopes, in bags, not documented in any way. And if there is no record, there is no fact of theft, no fact of loss, no object itself. In response to the scandal, the museum announced a program to digitize 100% of its collection within 5 years. What was once deemed impossible suddenly became urgent. By the autumn of 2023, around 650 items were returned. The remaining 1,500 are unaccounted for. They could be with buyers who were unaware of what they purchased, melted down, or resold elsewhere. Remember this logic. If an item is not in the database, it can be removed, and no one will notice the loss. This is not a characteristic of the British Museum. It's an architectural feature of any large institution, where the speed of acquisitions has historically outpaced the speed of cataloging. And this is exactly how the journey of such an object is organized, from its acquisition to invisibility. An item arrives at the museum as part of a donation, a batch from excavations, or confiscated cargo. The box receives a lot number. The entry in the receipt log reads, "Such and such quantity of items, excavations from such and such year." The box is sent to storage. There it waits for its turn for individual processing, description, photography, assignment of an inventory number. The queue can take years. It may not move at all. New batches arrive, new boxes, new decades. Meanwhile, the item without a number hits the wall with every step. Insurance, a number is needed. Temporary exhibition, a number is needed. Request from another museum, a number is needed. Scientific publication, a number is needed. The system works. It's just that the item does not exist within it. In science, this subject does not exist in a sense that is more important than all administrative constraints. Scientific knowledge is built on citation. One study references another. Data accumulates. A subject without an inventory number cannot be mentioned in a publication. Only the number gives strength to the reference. It cannot be compared to analogs from other collections. There is no common entry point in the databases. Any discovery that it could confirm or refute happens without it. It is in the building.
But in the scientific discussion about the past, its voice is absent. The scandal involving Peter Higgs revealed this not as an isolated case of theft, but as a systemic vulnerability that existed within the very system of accounting. This is more significant than the theft itself. Now, the next level of this same story. After the scandal, several other museums conducted internal audits. The results were not published in detail. However, within professional circles, it became known that some of them also have items that were listed as available but could not be physically located. These are not thefts, most likely. They are errors in movement, incorrect labeling, or loss during relocations. But from the viewer's perspective, the difference is insignificant. The item was there, now it is not. 1901, Greece. Divers are retrieving items from a sunken trading ship near the island of Antikythera. Bronze statues, marble figures, amphorae, jewelry. And then, a dark lump, resembling a piece of rock, covered in marine deposits. The size of a large book, heavy, unremarkable, incomprehensible. They put it in a box. The museum focuses on statues. They are beautiful. They are understandable. The lump is incomprehensible. The curator has no tools for its interpretation. There are no analogs in known collections. There is no category into which it could be placed. It is not a coin, not an ornament, not a tool of a recognizable type. 2 years later, the object falls and cracks. Inside are chirluan. Thus, the Antikythera mechanism was discovered. A complex analog computer capable of predicting the positions of the sun and moon, astronomical events, and the dates of the Olympic Games. The first mechanical computer known to us from history, created in Greece around the 2nd century BC. Note the scale of what was in the box. The mechanism contains gears with a tooth count ranging from 8 to 220. A differential mechanism allows for the simultaneous tracking of multiple independent astronomical cycles. Scales made of bronze with engraving that can be read without magnification. For comparison, engineers in Europe will achieve comparable accuracy in mechanical clocks approximately 1,500 years after this ship. He wasn't hidden. He was simply not seen, because they didn't know exactly what they were looking for. But the story doesn't end here. It becomes even more telling. During the ascent, the mechanism broke into 82 fragments. They were catalogued, studied, and described. But in 2005, exactly 100 years after the recovery from the seabed, a fragment was discovered in the boxes of the National Museum of Athens that had been there all along. It was just that no one had opened that specific box. 105 years, in the same building, 5 meters away from the other fragments. The tomography conducted in 2005 revealed 37 gears in one mechanism. Further studies in 2016 uncovered an even more complex structure. The mechanism was not hidden. It simply went unseen because it did not fit what was expected to be found. Too complex for its time. Too unlike what was supposed to exist. The official explanation is institutional overload. There were many artifacts after the collection. Sorting took months. This fragment ended up in the wrong box. That's right. But the result is the same. 105 years, as if it doesn't exist. Now the second case. Another country, another century, the same logic. But here, it's no longer coincidence. 1961. The
the Netherlands. The Rembrandt Research Project, an international group of scholars, begins a systematic review of the legacy of the great master. Tools: dendrochronology, X-rays, chemical analysis of pigments. The goal is to separate the originals from workshop pieces and later copies. This is a large-scale scientific project. Over several decades of work, it will erase around 150 paintings from the official legacy of Rembrandt. To erase means to change the status from Rembrandt to workshop or copy. The status is updated in the database. The painting is removed from the exhibition. The insurance value drops by tens of times. The item is either moved to storage or sold to a private collection. The painting, The Vision of Zechariah in the Temple, is subject to revision in 1961. Experts examine the photograph. They deliver their verdict: a copy, not Rembrandt. The painting goes into a private collection and disappears from the sight of researchers for 65 years. In 2026, the Rijksmuseum declares, "This is a genuine Rembrandt." Macro XRF scanning, a technology that did not exist in 1961, has uncovered compositional changes in the paint layers that are characteristic of the artist's work. The master altered the composition during the process, rewriting details. A copyist does not do this. They follow the original. Analysis of the wood panel, 1625 to 1640. This is precisely the period when Rembrandt was actively working. Scientists in 1961 evaluated the painting based on a photograph, not on the original. They had no tools, only experience and their eyes. And this is what makes this story significant, not as an exception, but as a rule. The project reviewed hundreds of paintings. Each review represents someone's life, either at stake or beyond the realm of academic focus. 65 years, because it just happened to be this particular private collector who provided the painting for research. But how many other copies are in the hands of those who are either in no rush or simply unaware that it's worth reaching out to researchers? 65 years did not exist. Not because they were stolen, not because they were destroyed, but because science provided an answer with tools that were previously lacking. And this answer closed the subject for the world as reliably as a brick in Naples. Now, an important thought. Authenticity is not a property of an object. It is a temporary consensus that changes with technology. Storages are filled with objects whose consensus has yet to be established. The Vision of Zechariah was rehabilitated because a private collector had the willingness to loan the painting for research. What if he hadn't? What if he had sold it to heirs who stored it away in a safe? 65 years would have turned into 120, or even 200. How many of these copies are currently in private collections, waiting for a device that doesn't yet exist? But there is also the flip side of the same coin. An item can not only turn out to be an authentic piece where it was thought to be a copy, it can also prove to be a forgery where it was considered a masterpiece. And this is a separate story about how a museum deals with its own mistake. 1915, New York. The Metropolitan Museum acquires 3 monumental sculptures that are exhibited as pinnacle examples of Etruscan art from the 5th century BC. Ancient Warrior, Colossal Head, Great Warrior. The height of the central figure is almost 2 meters. Power, archaic seriousness, intricate handling of terracotta. For its time, it was a sensation. A proof of how Greek influence transformed Etruscan sculpture. The items are placed in a separate hall. Dedicated monographs are devoted to them, and they are included in all textbooks on ancient art. For 46 years, they have stood in display cases as undeniable originals. 1961. The museum publishes a 28-page study. Conclusion: all three sculptures are forgeries, created in Rome around 1914 by the Riccardi brothers and master Alfredo Fioravanti. How was it discovered? Several technical details that were ignored at the time. Manganese dioxide in the glaze, a pigment that the Etruscans did not use. The absence of ventilation holes for firing. In original Etruscan sculptures of this scale, they are essential. Otherwise, there would be a rupture during firing. The perfect preservation of the colors is unrealistic for objects that allegedly lay in the ground for 2,000 years. And finally, one of the masters, shortly before his death, spoke about how the work was done. But here's what is important to understand about what happened during those 46 years. There were critics. Italian specialists since the 1920s pointed out inconsistencies. Curator Gisela Richter dismissed objections, using the authority of the museum as an argument. The institution defended its verdict because acknowledging a mistake meant admitting that several generations of experts had failed to notice the forgery in their own gallery. This is what makes this case special among all the others. It's not that someone deliberately bought a counterfeit with the intention to deceive the public. The issue is that institutional prestige has become a shield for errors. The more authoritative the museum, the harder it is to contest its attribution from within and from outside. An Italian expert from a provincial journal pointing out discrepancies in the glaze. Who is he against the Metropolitan Museum? His opinion was ignored for 40 years. It works both ways. The same mechanism that allows the Metropolitan to determine what is considered authentically Etruscan also dictates what the viewer considers important from Etruscan heritage. If the Metropolitan displays military scenes, it implies that the Etruscans were warlike. If burial items are kept hidden in storage, it suggests that their burial cult is less significant. Decisions about exhibition and attribution are one and the same power. After the sculpture was exposed, it was placed in storage. In professional circles, this place is sometimes referred to as the morgue, a repository for items that can no longer be displayed. Too awkward, too compromising, too complex to explain to the public. How many such patients are currently in the morgues of major museums around the world? Objects that once were icons, but now lie in drawers without an inventory description, simply because the museum does not know what to do with them. But sometimes an item disappears from the public space not due to a mistake of science, but because of a mistake of hands. The year is 2014. Cairo, the Egyptian Museum. Scheduled cleaning of Tutankhamun's mask. 3,300 years old. Pure gold. Lapis lazuli. Carnelian. The most recognizable artifact of Egypt. Insured for an amount that the museum does not officially disclose. During the cleaning process, the beard, the gilded overlay that was attached separately, comes off. The employee grabs what is at hand, epoxy glue. He applies it. The beard is stuck on, crookedly. Glue drips are running down the golden surface. The museum provides no information. Several months pass. Photos of the streaks end up on the internet, accidentally taken by tourists in the adjacent hall. Only then is there an official acknowledgement of the fact. The mask is removed from the exhibition. German restorer Christian Ekman conducts emergency restoration using a specialized wax composition. The beard is returned to its place, but the traces of epoxy glue on the surface of gold are irreversible. The epoxy has hardened in the metal's micropores. Removing it completely without risking damage to the gold itself is impossible. The most famous artifact of Egypt has changed its appearance. The museum has not issued an official statement regarding the nature of the damages. An official press release stated, "The restoration has been successfully completed." Now look at this through 4 states. In the display case, a mask, looking familiar, like in all the academic photographs. In the catalog, a description of the item before the incident. In storage, several months under restoration, with no explanations for the public. In the official report, work completed. The emptiness between these 4 lines is exactly what the audience cannot see. Another case, a different scale of damage, the same logic of concealing the mistake. The Hatay Museum in Turkey houses one of the world's finest collections of Roman mosaics, gathered in a region that has been a crossroads of civilizations for millennia. The mosaics date from the 1st to the 4th centuries AD. They depict themes of hunting, mythology, and marine scenes. True masterpieces of ancient decorative art, they were discovered in villas, baths, and public buildings. Several central mosaics have undergone restoration. The specialists themselves describe the result as monstrous. This is not just a summary, but a term from the professional assessments of people who have seen the items before and after. The color has changed. The texture has been disrupted. The new mortar used to secure the tesserae has altered the light reflection. The surface has lost the interplay of light that made the mosaic come alive. It is impossible to display them in their current state. The viewer will not focus on the piece, but rather on the trace of interference. And here is what is important to understand in this case. The restoration was carried out with good intentions. The mosaics needed strengthening. Some tesserae were peeling away. The technique used was standard for its time. However, the result turned out to be destructive. This is referred to as iatrogenic damage, harm caused by treatment rather than the disease itself. No one is to blame intentionally, but now the items are unavailable. And they remain unavailable. Because there is no turning back, and no one is in a hurry to acknowledge this publicly. Physics hides without choice. Morality hides out of shame. The law hides out of respect. A mistake made by hand hides because it cannot be corrected. Museums hide not only the past, they hide their own mistakes. And this is a special kind of concealment, because the object exists, is nearby, but is publicly inaccessible precisely because of what has been done to it. Before moving on to scale, there's another physical barrier that is rarely discussed. In the collections of military history and technical museums around the world, there are hundreds of compass, chronometers, and aiming devices from the time of World War II. Nothing special at first glance. Navigational equipment, standard military history. Until you start to dig into the details of production. Until the mid-1960s, the dials of military watches and compasses were coated with luminous paint. This paint contained radium-226, which provided a constant glow without an external source. practical for nighttime operations, dangerous for everything else. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. A compass made in 1941 emits roughly the same amount today as it did then. Gamma radiation does not get stopped by the thin glass of the display case. It reaches the visitor. The dose will be imperceptible to them, but it exists. In most museums, such items are now stored away or replaced with reproductions. Official explanations are usually brief. The item has been temporarily removed from the exhibition. The real reason lies in a radiation safety report that the visitor will never see. Again, 4 states. In the display case, an empty space or a sign. In the catalog, a complete description of the device. In the storage room, a closed container. In the report, a calculation of the accumulated dose for visitors over the year at the current exposure level.
Physics hides without explanations, just quietly and carefully.
After the restoration disasters, a scale of a different kind, a completely different scale. The Smithsonian Institution holds 157 million objects. The majority of them are what professionals refer to as bulk finds, mass archaeological discoveries, fragments of pottery, bones, slag, chunks of processed stone, remnants of metallurgical processes. All of this accounts for up to 80% of the total volume of archaeological collections on the planet. The catalog entry for such a box looks like this. Box 42. Fragments of red clay pottery, Ephesus, excavations of 1888, 5 kilograms. No images, no description of individual fragments, just weight and context. The official stance of the museum community is that every fragment carries information. Isotope analysis, traces of DNA in ceramics, the chemical composition of clay, and firing temperature analysis have all become technically feasible in the last 30 years. A shard that seemed worthless in 1880 can today provide data about climate, trade routes, and the health of populations. The logic is ironclad. But here is a question that it doesn't answer. If each of these millions of boxes needs to be opened, every fragment described, photographed, and entered into a database, how many man-years will this take at the current pace? Calculate it. With the staff of curators at a large museum and the current digitization speed, the answer is clear. It will never be done. This is what is called inventory paralysis. The custodian spends years reconciling boxes of broken dishes, while unique items wait their turn for attribution. The system works, just not in the way intended. It conserves the status quo rather than moving towards it. There is another side to this issue that is rarely discussed publicly. When a museum receives new materials from excavations, it is obligated to accept and preserve them.
This is a legal requirement in many countries. However, accepting and preserving does not mean studying. The boxes arrive, are labeled with a batch number, and go into storage. Then the next batch arrives, and then another one. Here is a concrete figure to understand the scale. A major excavation in Israel in the 1990s yielded around 200,000 artifacts over several years of work. This is just one site, just a few years. Museums in the region have still not completed the primary cataloging of this collection. Now multiply by the number of excavations around the world over the last 200 years. There is one more aspect that is almost never discussed publicly. Many museums not only store what they have found or purchased themselves, they also keep confiscated and
seized materials, items detained at customs, taken from smugglers, or transferred from police storage. The origins of such items are unknown. Attributing them is difficult. Displaying them is legally risky. What if the true owner comes forward? And so they remain. In a special section of the collection, marked with the label Status Uncertain. In major museums around the world, there are hundreds of thousands of such materials. Now, the most specific nail of this block. 2014, Norwegian Museum. The curator opens a box marked Organic Waste, Excavations of Lilleberg, 1894. The box hasn't been opened in 120 years. Inside, among bones, fragments of fabric, and other waste, lies a silver fibula. A fastener from the Viking era, 9th–10th century. Impeccable preservation. 120 years. In a box labeled trash. In the UK, there is currently serious discussion about a deselection protocol, the official right for museums to destroy some mass material after basic data has been recorded, in order to make space for new items. Not because the material is useless, but because there is no physical space, no money, and the likelihood that anyone will open these boxes during the lifetime of the current staff is approaching zero. This statement has sparked a heated debate within the professional community. One side argues, if we cannot retain everything, we must honestly acknowledge this and destroy documents rather than pretending that everything is stored and waiting. The other side contends, once you start destroying, where do you draw the line? Who decides what constitutes massive ballast? The same official who determines what falls into the 1%? The dispute remains unresolved, but the practice is already underway, just unofficially. Some items quietly disappear from the records without any protocol, not because they are deliberately destroyed, but because they get lost during moves and reorganizations. In large museums, there have been several moves to new buildings over the course of 200 years. Each move carries the risk of loss. Every reorganization of collections entails the risk of labeling errors. The remote storage facilities of large museums are located 15 to 20 kilometers from the main building. There is no public transport to these locations. Access is restricted to a narrow circle of specialists, available only by appointment several weeks in advance. An object without attribution, without a name, without context, without even an approximate date, simply waits. Year after year. A box on the bottom shelf in a hangar on the outskirts of the city. How many items of the Antikythera mechanism level are currently in such boxes? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a statistically inevitable situation. When the count involves millions of items and tens of thousands of unlabeled boxes, a portion of them inevitably contains something that could change our understanding of the past. We simply don't know it, because no one has opened them. And here arises the question that I want to ask you. What happens when a museum tries to change that? When it decides to show not just 1%, but everything? In St. Petersburg, in the area of Staraya Derevnya, the Hermitage has a storage facility, 35,000 square meters of open space. Visitors can enter and see carriages suspended from special structures, pull-out shelves filled with porcelain, where each shelf can be opened like a drawer, carved slabs, complete furniture sets, tapestries on sliding frames. All the items that cannot physically fit in the main halls of the Winter Palace due to their weight or size. It seemed, here it is, openness. Everything is visible. But look at the conditions. only with a guide. Photography is prohibited even here in the storage area. The route is fixed. Visit time is limited. Advance booking is required. In other words, the objects are visible, but control over how and what exactly the visitor sees is completely retained. Depot Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam has gone even further. This building houses 151,000 items, 99% of the entire collection, physically available for viewing. The organizational principle is completely unconventional. Not by periods, not by types of art, but by 5 climatic storage zones: metal, plastic, organic materials, mixed compositions, special conditions. Visitors can see conservators at work through a glass partition. They see how items are actually stored, not restored and lit, but as they truly are. The result of this experiment is unexpected. When visitors to Depot see 99%, their first reaction is not delight. Their first reaction is confusion. Too much. Too diverse. Too little thread to grab onto. Objects without a story are just things. A chaotic archive without a guiding thread. Understanding anything without interpretation is practically impossible. This is a valuable observation. It explains why 1% is not a conspiracy.
Selection is necessary precisely to foster understanding, rather than merely a sense of volume. The curator is a translator between the past and the viewer. Without translation, the viewer stands before an incomprehensible text in an unfamiliar language. But here is the question that Depot makes visible. If a translation is needed for understanding, it means that what we comprehend about the past is not the past itself. It is a translation, and any translation has a translator. With their choice of words, their emphases, their understanding of what is important to convey, and what can be omitted for the sake of clarity. And this translator is a curator, a living person working in a specific era with particular ideas about what is significant. Their choice is not neutral, even when they are honest, even when they adhere to the highest professional standards. And this brings us to the final question, the most important one. 8 barriers. The poison in the material is arsenic, making objects literally deadly. Chemical decay is a masterpiece dying from a glance. Moral censorship is a brick that has sealed away 200 years of culture. Legal prohibition is a law that makes objects physically inaccessible. Scientific error is a painting that lay in a private collection for 65 years under an incorrect verdict. Human error is a mask that changed its appearance forever. Storage scale is millions of objects that no one will ever open. Curatorial selection is 1 out of 100 having undergone editing. None of them is called a conspiracy. Each one individually has a completely rational explanation. Physics is physics. Chemistry is chemistry. Laws are enacted by parliaments. Science is prone to error. Storage space is limited. Sometimes hands fail. But look at the result. All these mechanisms, be it arsenic dust in a bird's taxidermy, brickwork in a Neapolitan museum, a box labeled organic waste, or an expert's verdict on a photograph, remove the object from view as effectively as if it had never existed. Different causes, one consequence. In the professional theory of museology, there is a concept known as the sonography of knowledge.
A museum does not mirror history, it stages it. From thousands of artifacts, the curator selects one talking masterpiece. The 999 other fragments, the ones that could provide a different, more complex, contradictory, and uncomfortable picture, fade into the shadows. The viewer sees 10 golden cups and concludes that the civilization was golden. He does not see the tons of rusty iron in the basement. He sees marble heroes and does not see the erotic amulets that the same people hung above their children's beds. He sees the attribution Rembrandt and does not see 65 years spent in a private collection under the verdict copy. This is not a lie, it is selection. But the result of the selection is a version of the past, not the past itself. Now take the next step in this logic. If each generation of curators presents a different perspective, then each generation of viewers receives a different image of the past. People who visited the Neapolitan Museum before the year 2000 had one understanding of Rome. People after that, another. Those who saw Etruscan warriors in the Met during the 1961 exhibition believed one thing. After that, something else. But both groups of viewers were convinced they were seeing the past. Both groups built their understanding of history based on what they were shown. This does not mean that all versions are equivalent. The version with accessible arsenic taxidermy is worse than the version without it, in a literal sanitary sense. The version without erotic artifacts from Pompeii is poorer and less accurate. The version with the authentic Rembrandt is richer than the version with a copy. But this means that what you consider to be history is always the result of someone's decisions made at a specific time for specific reasons. Some of these reasons are honest physics. Some are honest science. Some are honest ethics. But part of it is simply inertia, overload, lack of funding, and untested assumptions. And this is what makes the translation unobtrusive for the viewer. A person entering the hall understands. There is a selection here. A reserve exists. They know that. But they do not know by what principle this particular item has been presented before them, rather than the 100 neighboring ones from the same collection. The curator chose one amulet from 200, the best preserved, the one that fits the narrative of the hall most effectively. The remaining 199 have disappeared without explanation. The viewer looks at the selected item and gets the feeling of a typical item of the era. Yet typicality is already an interpretation. This is the mechanics of translation in action. The translator does not lie. They choose which word out of 10 possibilities best conveys the meaning. And that word is the only one the reader will see. The other 9 remain on the page. The result is not malicious intent. The result is the structure of any story about the past that claims to be understandable. Understandability requires a choice. A choice is always someone's version of significance. The viewer of this version does not see it. They see the object. That is why the question of what the museum hides is not a question about the museum. It is a question about what you know about the past and where that knowledge comes from. And now, at a moment when decolonization, ethical prohibitions, and repatriation are becoming part of the everyday practice of museums, a new dimension is being added. The absence of an object itself becomes a statement. The empty space in the display case speaks louder than the exhibit. The brown paper covering the display cases in New York is also an exhibition, just of a different kind. In the professional community, this is referred to as architectural repentance, when the absence of an object carries a stronger meaning than its presence. But remorse is also a form of selection. The decision to remove is just like the decision to showcase. The curator is still a curator. It's just that now he works with emptiness rather than fullness. Look at the same thing through the lens of a specific viewer. The teacher who brings a class receives one narrative, designed for the initial encounter with history. The researcher with a specific topic receives another, through a catalog, a request to the archives, access to items not on display. The tourist with 3 hours gets a third, a route through the icons selected by the institution's internal logic. A child visiting for the first time receives a fourth, a version deemed appropriate by the curator for an introductory experience with the past. One museum, the same walls, 4 different portrayals of history, and each one seems to its recipient to be unique and complete. Look at it from a different angle. You spend 30 seconds on an item that has passed through 7 filters to end up in front of you. 0 seconds on everything that hasn't gone through a single one. The piece hanging on the wall captures your attention precisely because it was chosen. Those lying in drawers without a photo in the catalog, they don't attract attention. This is not a neutral situation. This is a pre-designed path of attention. To understand this is not to look with suspicion. It is to notice that the path exists. Look at this. On average, a visitor spends less than 30 seconds in front of an exhibit in a museum. This is the statistic studied in several major institutions around the world. 30 seconds, and the person moves on. During a day's visit to the museum, they might see 300 to 400 items, 30 seconds for each of them. Now look at this from another perspective. The object in the hall has gone through several selections before it ended up before you. First, it survived excavation, remained intact, and was not destroyed. Then, it ended up in a museum collection, rather than a private collection or the antique market. Next, it survived storage, avoiding becoming a victim of arsenic or inventory errors. After that, it passed through a curatorial selection and was deemed sufficiently significant. Then, it underwent attribution, not being classified as a copy or disputed. And finally, it passed safety checks, ethical considerations, and conformity with contemporary views on what is appropriate. Each of these filters is independent of the others. Each operates according to its own logic. Their combination determines the 1% that you see. What you have seen in the museum all your life is not the past. It is a version of the past that someone deemed fit to present. Sometimes that someone is physics. Sometimes it is the law. Sometimes it is a curator with specific beliefs about what is important. Sometimes it is just a box that hasn't been opened in 120 years. The difference between these reasons is enormous. The result is the same. 8 million items in London, 3 million in St. Petersburg, 157 million in Washington. These are not just numbers. They represent a horizon behind which lies all the past that couldn't fit into the narrative. Some of it exists there due to poison, some due to mistakes, some due to shame, and some simply because no one has opened the box. And this is what is important to keep in mind. The story continues. What today lies in the box marked organic waste may tomorrow turn out to be a brooch from the Viking era. What is listed as a copy will be recognized as an original in 65 years. What is hidden behind a brick wall for moral reasons will become the central exhibit in 200 years. What emits radiation or arsenic will someday receive decontamination technology. This is not consolation. This is mechanics. Every time this mechanism turns, some part of the past returns from oblivion. Not because someone organized it deliberately, but because technology has matured. The political climate has changed. The law has been rewritten. Or simply, someone opened the wrong drawer. Here is an exact image of what happens at the moment when you stand in front of an object in the hall. Before you is not the past. Before you is a translation of the past, carried out by an honest specialist, professionally, with the best intentions. And yet, it is still different from the original, because the original is all 8 million objects simultaneously, with contradictions, with unknown contents in the boxes, with a context that is yet to be restored. This cannot be shown. What is presented is what has already been understood, filtered, and put on stage. Knowing this doesn't mean trusting less. It means looking more precisely, with the right question in mind. The next time you enter a museum, don't just look at what hangs on the walls. Look at the walls themselves, at the doors behind which there is no passage, at the description of an item that isn't in the hall, at the empty space with the label "temporarily removed from display," at the brown paper covering the showcases, at the entry in the catalog without a photograph. Ask the curator, what was hanging here a year ago? Try to register for the storage. In many large museums, this is technically possible, but no one knows about this option. Find the online catalog and see how many items are listed without a photograph, just a text entry. Open any page of the Smithsonian catalog. There are thousands of such entries. The item exists. The description exists. There are no images. No one has seen it long enough to photograph it. This is the part of the museum that does not exist for most people. Not because it is hidden, because no one asks. It is precisely there, the past that is not yet for you.